What's up, everybody? We are here in the Outer Banks, and this is going to be my first short behind-the-scenes edit of a photo shoot. We are at a park called Jockey Ridge State Park. It's free to the public. It's basically a giant sand dune here on the banks of North Carolina. And apparently it's the largest coastal sand dune in the country. It's an interesting place. It is full of people meditating and doing other things, but it's really interesting. It's big, it's golden hour, it's about an hour until sunset, so we are trying to find a good composition out here and get set up, trying to avoid all the footsteps of the day, and see what we can get. So stay tuned. Okay, so this is our scene right here. We finally found something that would work, although it was really difficult because the sand is just totally demolished from all the foot traffic during today, and ATVs, which you can hear in the background. This is not going to be my greatest shot by any means, but I still want to do the video, so I'm going to carry on. My thinking here is that I can shoot the sun right as it dips below the horizon, and that will give me a really nice sun star if I use f/16 or higher. So I can get the sun star, and then I can also, I want to expose for the front of this bush right here, which kind of does a 1, 2, 3 into the sun. So we have the bottom third here, second third here, and then we have a nice sun star here at the end as it's setting. I would have liked to have get some of the nice ridges, but that's just not going to be possible tonight. So I have my tripod set nice and low. I'm using f/16. I'm somewhere around a shutter speed of 1/15 of a second or so. And I'm using ISO 200 just to freeze the motion. I want to be actually probably bump it up just a little bit to be able and freeze the motion of the grass, because there's a little bit of wind blowing and we don't want any of that in our shot. The grass needs to appear nice and sharp. So yeah, this is our setup. Again, it's not the best, but I'm gonna roll with it. The park is just a really easily trafficked place because it's public, it's free. But it is a really beautiful sunset, no doubt. And here goes the sun. I will show you the editing process next. Okay, so we are here in my impromptu editing suite, just outside of Charleston, South Carolina. We traveled south after the Outer Banks. My wife and I managed to pick up a house sitting gig here in Charleston at a really nice place. We're here for a week for Thanksgiving. It's really great to be able to do this sort of thing because we can stop, we can use the Wi-Fi, and we can really sit down and take care of some things that we aren't able to do in the van all the time. So here I am. I'm going to go ahead and edit the Jockey Ridge Dune photograph that I took, and I want to walk you through kind of the process I use. I'm on a MacBook Pro 15-inch. I also use a Wacom Intuos Pro tablet. It's the medium size. I think the small is just fine, but this one works really well. I love it. It makes editing a lot easier. So here we are. I use Lightroom. I usually cull images in Lightroom. I catalog them in Lightroom. I do my raw adjustments in Lightroom, and then I almost always bring them into Photoshop to make my final adjustments. So what I did in this case was I wanted to, the scene wasn't exactly what I was looking for. There was a lot of foot traffic on the dunes during the day, which kind of makes it difficult to give that feeling that you're in a very isolated place. You don't want to see any sort of debris or anything that makes you feel like the location has been foot trafficked all day long. It's just not a good look for a landscape photograph, but I found the best composition I could. It's not my favorite, but I wanted to go ahead and show you guys what I did with this photo in Lightroom. And this is the final image right here after my edits, and it's composed of two other images. One here that's darker, giving you the nice colors in the sky, as well as the very awesome sun star, which I feel like is the subject of the photograph, as well as another exposure for the foreground. So we get some of this texture here in the dunes. We can see more of the grass here. And I thought the collective of those two combined together would make a really nice photo. So I'll open these up into Photoshop here, and I've already done the edit, so I just kind of want to walk you through what I've done and show you how I did it. The very first thing to do is to blend the two layers together. So here I have the exposure for the sun stars and the sky, and then beneath that I have an exposure for the foreground. And the first thing you'll notice between these two is that there's quite a bit of difference in luminosity between them. And what you want to do is you want to normalize. You want to normalize the two layers. You don't want them to be so drastically different that the blending process doesn't appear smooth. So this layer right here, this curves adjustment layer, was a means of, let's see here, of basically brightening up the sky and sun star exposure just a bit to get it a little closer to the exposure we see here in the foreground. And the way I blended these two was I go to my channels palette and I will command click on the RGB channel to essentially create a selection of the brightest luminosity values in the image. What that allows me to do is to come back in here and essentially with a brush tool I can paint white over the sky here, which will allow me to create a mask that looks just like this basically. So what you're seeing here, if I turn this mask on and off, you'll see that before without the mask we just have the sunset, and when I turn the mask on we now have more luminosity here. We have more tonal values here in the foreground that allow us to kind of see what we have up front of the photograph, as well as maintain the sun star and the sky that we wanted to keep as well. So those two together are my blended layers, and after that I will create a stamp visible layer, which is what we see here. With the stamp, the next thing I like to do oftentimes is do the Orton effect. The Orton effect gives you that hazy kind of atmospheric look that is a little dreamy, you know, and you can take it too far. I don't like to take it too far, but I do like the results it gives me. And it's just, if you just look, it's just barely imperceptible here. And I actually have it at an opacity of 15%. If I crank it up, you can really see what it does. And basically all I'm doing is creating two stamp visible layers. And on the top layer, I'm applying a blur. We go to blur, Gaussian blur, and I use something around 40%. Once that's done, I then just adjust the opacity of that top layer to something that looks suitable. And in this case, I felt that this was just enough to kind of give me a dreamy look that I was going for. After that, I will again do another stamp visible layer, and I will bring my photograph into Google Nik, which is a plug-in software that's free. Google Nik, N-I-K. It's a filter. You can come in here, you can do Color Effects Pro, and I'll just go ahead and open it up real quick to show you what I'm talking about. I have a couple of different filters I like to use often, but in this case, the one I almost always use is Pro Contrast. Pro Contrast allows you to get amazing detail throughout your image. You can adjust a color cast with it here. You see the changes. I usually use a dynamic contrast of around 25% and correct contrast of around 15%, but again, it's subjective, it's opinionated. Whatever it is you decide you want to do, you can play around with it and see what kind of results you get. So that is what this layer is representing here. You can see that it's really brought out a lot of detail and enhanced the contrast and colors throughout the image. This layer here is essentially just removing a lot of debris I found in the foreground that I thought kind of distracted from what was going on. I mean, that stuff is there, it's inevitable, but I feel like without it, it makes a much cleaner image. There's also some sensor dust spots up here in the sky that really become very apparent when you use this Color Effects Pro filter. It really brings out the contrast and accentuates those dust spots, which you don't want. So this layer is for removing that. The next layer here was, let's see, I'm gonna open this up. Essentially what I did was created a midtones mask that you'll see here. And I did that using a TK Actions panel. I'm not going to go into detail on this particular edit as to how I did it, but all I'm really doing, and you can achieve the same thing just using a curves layer and locking down the middle and moving the middle of the midtones curve up and down. But basically what I was trying to do here was darken the image just a bit around the outsides while brightening the middle and adding warmth. So I wanted to really draw our attention towards the middle of the photograph, towards the sun star, while limiting all the extraneous detail in the outskirts, which is really not the subject of our photo and is something we just don't want the viewer looking at. So that's what this is doing here. It's kind of a vignetting effect, but there's also some warmth added in the middle here. It's just drawing our attention more towards the middle of the photograph. This is almost the exact same thing. I did a stamp visible, and I'm just adding more warmth to the middle of the photograph to really pull you in towards the sun, which was bright and warm and inviting and lighting up the sides of the bush here. Next, something I almost always do is dodge and burn. So what I did was I basically create a new layer, and I will fill that layer with 50% gray, and then I will change the blending mode to soft light. At that point, what you have, let's just go ahead and do it. At that point, what you have is essentially just your image. I can turn this on and off, and there's no difference. There's no difference at all. But when you use your brush tool at a very low opacity, usually 10 or 5%, you can come in and really accentuate some of these ridges here. It's really a way of adding contrast, very selective contrast to parts of the image that you want the viewer to look at. I added some contrast here in the bushes. You can even go ahead, you can even change the color that you're dodging with to something that's the same color of the light, which is not just pure white. And see, just that little bit, we've really increased the contrast here locally, and it's another way to draw attention to where you want your viewers to look. And that's the before and after of this particular layer. And then finally, I went ahead, I usually do a sharpening pass, especially with something like this. There's a lot of really nice detail here in this bush. The sun stars can benefit from, let's just go ahead, whoops, my mistake. We'll go ahead and zoom in here. If you just look closely, you can see how all this detail is brought out by the high pass filter. And it's not everywhere. I only apply it to certain parts of the image. I usually do the filter, and then I'll create a mask, and I will mask it in wherever I want it to be. And I mask it in essentially to the areas where I want the viewer to be looking. And the way you do this is you create a stamp visible. So I basically copy all the layers down, Shift, Alt, Command, E. You come into Filter, Other High Pass. This is really dependent on the size of your image and how much detail there is, but I never use anything more than a radius of 2. In this case, I did use a 2. If you select OK, and then you come down and you change your blend mode to overlay, what you will see is an incredible amount of detail being enhanced throughout the image. Now, it obviously can go way too far, which is why I almost always apply the mask, paint it in, and then I will even adjust the opacity in some cases. I didn't feel that was necessary here, but if the effect is too strong, you can create halos, white halos around some of the areas of high contrast, which is really undesirable. So just be careful when you're using this effect, but it is a really great way to, again, draw attention to certain parts of the image. And while it's subtle, it makes a huge difference at the end of the day. So this is the before and after. Let's see here. Before, after. Not too much to this image. Again, it wasn't one of my favorite compositions, but I thought for what it is, it turned out pretty well. The sun star is really amazing. The bush came out really nice and sharp, and it was a really cool place overall. It would just probably be better to visit during a different time of the year. So this is my image from Jockey Ridge, and I hope you have enjoyed watching my tutorial. If you'd like to see more, I'm going to start doing this regularly. My website is www.mkallenphotography.com. I will post a link to it here on the photo page, as well as a link to my YouTube site, which is where I will host this video. And I hope you subscribe and keep following along as I make more of these videos. Thanks.